Hello, dear friends. Today is Wednesday, December 13th, and here is what's in today's issue. Black political swans are flying in Trump's direction. Incoming information testifies, or rather confirms, yesterday's forecast by the Daily Beast that the next 2 years for Trump will be quite difficult, if not to say hard. President Zelensky stated that he is ready for elections under wartime conditions, given certain circumstances. Meanwhile, in the Russian language information space, reports have appeared citing mythical characters who assure us that an easy victory awaits Zelensky. Judging by these swans, so to speak, the Zelensky administration has already begun its election campaign. The European Union will freeze, for a certain or rather indefinite term, almost $250 billion of frozen Russian assets in Europe. This will be done to provide Ukraine with this massive loan, contrary to the resistance of the United States of America and their adepts, let's call them Trump's people, in Europe. There are increasing hints that the American plan for a settlement in Ukraine includes something resembling the Korean scenario. In this regard, the joint actions of the Russian Federation and Chinese air forces directed against South Korea, specifically in the area of the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, are drawing attention. Are Moscow and the Trump administration already practicing joint actions to violate this demilitarized zone, the very creation of which the U.S. administration is currently suggesting Ukraine think about? The new Cold War continues in Europe, driven by the realization of what has happened following the publication of the new United States National Security Strategy. An assessment of the chronological chain of events leading to this document involuntarily suggests thoughts about the Kremlin's possible involvement in the appearance, and more importantly, the content of this document. We will examine this issue together. Finally, following the indication that international law must become the fundamental basis for a settlement in Ukraine, which President Zelensky stated the other day, today, he also stated that this document must be ratified by the U.S. Senate. This is the second most important requirement, which ensures that this agreement, if reached, will truly be an international treaty imposing obligations on the participating parties. In connection with this, we will examine further guarantees and requirements that Ukraine should have presented or placed on the negotiating table with the United States, as well as offered for consideration to European allies. Especially since yesterday, as we expected, a joint draft of a peace agreement compiled by Ukraine and its European allies was supposed to be announced or published. Today it was announced that it will be published soon, meaning work continues. In this regard, I would like to continue our joint work, as there is evidence that it is yielding certain results. So, in this context, we will look at the option of an international legal treaty that would close all the loopholes that moles, Ukraine's ill-wishers, might want to drill or dig into that agreement currently being worked on by Europe, Ukraine, and the United States. But now, let's start in order. The results of the anticipated mayoral elections in Miami have become known, and a sensation occurred. For the first time in 28 years, Miami was won by, firstly, a woman, and secondly, a Democrat. Why is this a sensation? Because for 30 years, some say almost 40, Miami has been a fortress of the Republican Party, impregnable to Democrats. And now, such a failure, and a major failure at that. This lady, named Camille Higgins, garnered 59% of the vote, while her opponent, Emilia Gonzalez, who was supported by none other than Donald Trump himself, gathered about 41%, a serious advantage. This is considered a historic victory. Some of the more passionate observers and analysts are saying, "Goodbye, our dear Donnie Trump." Well, I think that is probably premature, but this is serious. A virtually impregnable fortress has been taken, by and large. This fact is regarded by moderate analysts as a symbol of hope that the United States remains an arena of change, and that what we have now is a variable that can be changed, and changed by existing legal means, without hysteria, without bloodshed, and without any civil wars. A second black swan flies following the first. Yale University published the results of a poll regarding how different age groups support or do not support Trump. The results here are simply stunning. That is, the youth, and here youth is considered pretty much anyone up to 65 years old, in their mass do not support Donald Trump and oppose him. In short, yes, this is a failure. Regarding specific groups, particularly farmers who largely voted for Trump in the central states, you know from my stories and other sources what a blow he dealt to a whole group of farmers growing soybeans with his tariff games, primarily with China. As a result, China completely stopped buying soybeans from American farmers. A terrible blow. Thousands of farms are on the brink of bankruptcy. Trump promised to do something. But firstly, the purchasing season has already ended. Everything is gone. The Chinese bought soy in Argentina and Brazil. They don't need American soy. Trump tried to conclude an agreement on the sale of super chips for artificial intelligence, setting a condition that the Chinese increase purchases in return. The Chinese promised, but the purchasing season is over, as I said, and if they do buy, it will be much less. In short, complete failure in this field as well. The next message is very important and alarming. As it has become known, a former deputy of the Ukrainian Rada, the son of the late chairman of the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, Leonid Derkach, the well-known Andrei Derkach, is a hero of Russia. This became known literally by accident. That is, today, December 10th, a list was published for the Day of the Hero of the Fatherland, the Russian fatherland, and Andrei Derkach's name was discovered there. It is unknown. That is, he wasn't awarded this title and the corresponding medal today. Usually, the Order of Lenin accompanied it back in the Soviet Union. I don't know about now. Most likely this title was awarded to him earlier, generally in secret. As you understand, Hero of Russia is the highest rank, the highest distinction. In the Soviet Union, such a title wasn't even given to those intelligence officers who effectively stole the atomic bomb from the United States back in the day. Imagine what kind of assistance one had to render to this Russian fatherland to receive the title of Hero of Russia now. Well, maybe. Maybe the requirements have lowered, but nonetheless. That is, there is likely a whole combination of factors here. It is clear that this mole, or from Russia's point of view, a super Russian intelligence officer, a super Russian SOR, worked in Ukraine ever since he arrived from Moscow, having successfully graduated from the FSB school, which in the Soviet Union was the Dzerzhinsky school, the KGB school. In the first chief directorate, they called it the School of Fools, and they practically never recruited into intelligence from there. Maybe something changed in the early 90s, though I doubt it. There was confusion and vacillation back then. In short, having finished the necessary School of Fools, he was deployed here. His dad held the position of SBU chairman. His dad himself was in contact, or rather had the closest ties, with Semyon Mogilevich, a specifically valuable agent of the first chief directorate of the KGB of the USSR, and later the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. He, as the senior figure, connected Mogilevich for business contacts and mutually beneficial business with then-President Kuchma. Later, Derkach engaged in a mass of unsavory deeds, as a result of which he fell under American sanctions in Ukraine. He was accused of high treason and illicit enrichment. He worked, effectively, as an agent of influence for the Russian Special Services. Then appropriate suspicions were brought against him, after which he calmly lived for several weeks in Sumy, in his fiefdom, where his electoral district was located. I rang the bell on this channel saying, "He is there. Stop him. Detain him." They didn't hear me, or pretended not to hear, but effectively, they let him leave. They let him leave just as they previously freed Samak, and just as after that, or around the same time, they handed back another particularly valuable agent of the Russian Federation, Medvedchuk. That is, this is an epic failure that has lasted since the year 2000. Maybe someday I will make a separate video on this topic and trace it. That is, counterintelligence, the role of which should be performed by the SBU in Ukraine, effectively does not work in Ukraine. I can prove this literally and documentarily based on specific facts since at least 2000. And it continues. What is happening now with Durkok is the same thing. This happened quite recently, and with Medvedchuk during the war. That is, Ukraine, generally any state, has no right to have such a special service, especially during a war. This matter needs to be stopped somehow. By all accounts, it will not be easy for Ukraine to continue with such a neighbor. This issue needs to be resolved. Zelensky, as is known, stated that he is ready to hold elections in Ukraine under certain conditions if the Allies ensure a ceasefire. He hinted that he is not afraid of these elections. And immediately in Ukraine, according to my observations, I open the internet, 1, 2, 3. Anonymous videos appear citing mythical characters, like former KGB colonels, or Vanga-level types who predict things once a century that definitely happen. And the meaning, of course, ultimately boils down to the fact that an easy victory awaits Zelensky. I believe this is the start of the election campaign. That is, the Zelensky administration has launched the election campaign. Apparently, they can begin. The European Union. The European Union is coming to an assessment. That is, a sort of awakening is happening in the EU in connection with the recent publication of the new security doctrine of the United States of America. That is, previously they pretended, like in that epic joke I told you, which applies to many political situations, where the husband says, "Honey, you are so smart. Come up with another excuse for me." So too here, the Europeans, and Ukraine represented by Zelensky, for a long time, and many still continue to do so, pretended to believe that the United States is our friend and that we can rely on them and their guarantees. But there is a growing number of voices saying we need to come to our senses, finally. They are speaking openly now, and if you take Trump's latest interview, it is simply provocative. Attention is drawn to the fact that a truly sharp U-turn has occurred. Relatively recently, there were whole delegations here from the EU. Trump received them quite warmly in the White House in the Oval Office. Everything seemed good, normal, everything returned. The period of madness seemed to have ended. Everything returned to traditional circles, good neighborly relations, traditional allies. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this document appears. The quantity and volume of these voices are growing, saying that it is truly time to decide. That is, we are effectively being forced. A situation is arising where Europe is being pushed into the ranks of opponents of the United States, while Russia is literally being dragged into their place. But considering those swans, the number and wingspan of which are growing, the question arises, is this so-called Trump security theory and the redrawing of the world map here for the long haul? And didn't those who created this security theory rush things? By the way, moving on, a big question arises. Who wrote this theory? Because many, during the discussion, noticed that it is some kind of disjointed text. The impression is that they grabbed paragraphs here and there, back and forth, quickly slapped them together, and that's it. It turned out to be a filkina gramota, a worthless piece of paper, because one only needs to look at the objective figures. The U.S. strategy says that NATO is generally not a force, that almost the entire continent is on the verge of civilizational disappearance. I look at the numbers. NATO versus Russia. Look, total people under arms. Well, it must be noted Russia is in wartime, while for Europe it is still peacetime. So in NATO, there are 3.5 million people under arms. In Russia, it's slightly more by 70,000, but Russia is mobilized, and mobilized several times. Population: 1 billion in Europe and 146 million in Russia, and Russia is in a demographic crisis. The population numbers are plummeting like a lead balloon. Aircraft: more than 2,000 in NATO, 1,152 in Russia. Quality: Europe has fifth-generation fighters. Russia doesn't have them even close. And if you count the Americans in there, the bomber aviation, taking into account the latest American bomber, cannot be compared to Russian bomber aviation at all. Naval forces: a substantial advantage. 1,000 surface ships and submarines in NATO versus 419 in Russia. Nuclear weapons: interestingly, this apparently takes into account the number of tactical nuclear warheads that the Americans have placed in 5 NATO countries in Europe, so by the total number of nuclear warheads, 5,900, Europe, SART, NATO, has an advantage over Russia. Budget: a budget of $1.3 trillion in NATO European countries versus $145 billion in the Russian Federation. Well, this is a failure, of course. What war? This is just about impudence, taking things by GOP stop, armed robbery tactics, a known technique of Russian diplomacy and all that. Only on the propaganda channels of the Russian Federation can one discuss questions of how easily Russia will reach the Atlantic.